now going to go into an interactive panel discussion. I don't want to see me driving this so much as hearing from the experts that we have in this room. I'm going to call up the panelists in order of their seating. If Nku Nyembezi-Heita could join me, outgoing CEO ArcelorMittal, and a South African chairman designate of the JSE Limited. Thank you very much, Nku. Jabu Mabuza, president of Business Unity South Africa. Pravin Gordhan, South African Finance Minister. Monhla Hlahla, chairperson of the IDC. And Colin Coleman, managing director, Goldman Sachs, Sub-Saharan Africa. We do have a roving mic, so if the protocol could be observed, if you do need to ask a question, I'm hoping that you are going to ask a question, put up your hand, we'll get that roving mic to you. If you could stand, state your name, where you're from, and then pose your question to the relevant panelist. Thank you all for joining me. I think, Minister, if we could just start picking up from your introduction. You've set the context for us as to where we've come from, 20 years of democracy. You've highlighted the successes. You've also established the challenges that we need to face over the next 20 years. And the answer, the National Development Plan, has been tabled. We tabled it in January 2013 at this very forum as well. Our biggest problem right now is our GDP. Sitting at, well, one of the big problems that we've got at 2.5%. The statisticians out there, the actuaries are saying that a country needs 7% GDP growth to effectively impact the unemployment rate in a country. Africa, we've got about 10 economies growing at above 6%. With that GDP growth rate, how are we going to address this looming unemployment that remains at heady levels, sitting around 25%, and youth unemployment rising to levels of 35%? Because that, in many instances, is a time bomb waiting to happen. And it's not just South Africa's problem. This is a global problem. Minister.
Thank you. Let me first recognize the presence of my colleague, Minister Karim, the Minister of Communications, and I'm sure he'll have a contribution to make on some of these questions as well. We all agree that the world requires higher GDP numbers. South Africa certainly requires higher GDP numbers. But just a comment before we get to the how part, and that is focusing on GDP alone, we've learned over the last 5 years particularly, is not an adequate measure of how well a society is doing. And I think more and more we need to talk about inclusivity. We need to talk about who benefits from growth and which sections of society. And all of us across the world, and that's why the WEF theme this year is Reshaping the World, are looking for answers on inclusivity and creating less inequality as a result of GDP. In the South African case, investment in infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier on, and we'll hear a lot more about it in the coming months. A lot of hard work has been done over the last 18 months in this regard, and my colleague can talk about the kind of policy direction we are going in the ICT area. Secondly, the job opportunities that government is creating, and we intend to work harder with the private sector. That's all around me here, and perhaps they can also tell you how much are we going to invest in this country, how are we going to create jobs. We now have the employment tax incentive, which is an indication of government's commitment to contributing to costs of employment, particularly of young people. And we hope that the private sector would take that up as well and begin to reduce the burden of unemployment on our society. But more importantly, we've got to find the right balance, which will ensure that we get the investments that's required in our economy. And certainly from a government point of view, we want to create even higher levels of policy certainty, which will encourage that kind of investment.
Colin, the 20 years of democracy highlighted by the Goldman Sachs report, again, alluding to many of the positives, but let's talk about this economic inclusion and how the report deals with how we are going to deal with that as a country going forward.
Well, let's just take a step back. I think the Minister did a fantastic job in presenting the objective reality of the last 20 years, and you have to applaud the fact that South Africa has managed to lift 16 million people in terms of support through social welfare from only 2 million at the beginning of the 20-year period. We have brought 10 million people into the middle classes. We have managed to create significant job opportunities, growing employment by 5 million. That hasn't kept up, and so the global WEF theme of inequality and unemployment, which is a global problem, is certainly the case in South Africa. And the good part is if we acknowledge the achievements, we can also deal with the challenges. I think that the Minister's touched on the global backdrop, and I would just add that we are now seeing the mainstream economies of the world entering a better phase. So the United States this year, Goldman Sachs forecasts to grow at 3.5%. We forecast China to grow at 7.8% in 2014. That combination and the stabilization of the conditions in Europe will effectively help South Africa as well. And so the backdrop of what's happening in the major global economies is certainly positive for the theme of South Africa and Africa. Remember, Africa, as you say, growing at 6% plus. The South African companies are extremely well positioned to benefit from that.
Monhla, let me bring you in here. How effective has black economic empowerment or broad-based black economic empowerment been in trying to address this economic inclusion, the problem of inequality in South Africa?
I think it's important for us to, at least in my view, to note that the strategy by the ruling party to effectively bring more people into the economy and to benefit from the economy as a first strategy was brilliant. All the indicators about how many people have been brought out of poverty, how many black businesses have been given the ability to start meaningful participation in the bigger economy are all great indicators of a society that has grappled with the issue of inclusivity, the issue of trying to find a balance. However, that great day of that first strategy is over, because now we are more required to look smartly at how we grow the very cake that we try to distribute to many. With all the benefits that we have made, how do we make sure that we can accelerate some of those initial initiatives by government to show the people of South Africa that the government of Nelson Mandela, the government of the ANC, the ruling party today is saying that inclusivity is more meaningful. That's why you are beginning to have more disposable income. You are able to move to higher LSMs. However, the issues of growth are going to say, yeah, B is fine. Yes, restructuring the economy is fine. You've got new sectors than just mining. But how do we grow the cake and faster? Because our challenges in terms of growing unemployment among the youth, what we're going to be doing with the aged, how we accelerate infrastructure, we turn our public works into probably a labor-intensive sector, they're all going to face us. All else great, we now have to be more innovative, more decisive, because those good days of low-hanging fruit, I believe, are over.
Nku, let me bring you in here. I think over the next couple of days at the World Economic Forum, we're going to be looking for tangible solutions, for short-term answers that private sector, public sector, civil society can embark on to impact the situation and to alleviate this pressure that we're seeing of income inequality. Oxfam put out a report recently saying that, in fact, it was just 2 days ago, saying that 85 people in the world hold half of the world's wealth. And I haven't misquoted that number. 85 people in the world hold half of the world's wealth in their hands. Let's enter the ArcelorMittal story. As we know, you are outgoing CEO. It's been a tough operating environment. Let's talk about this inclusion, about how you can distribute profits within an organization, perhaps more equitably.
Well, before we go into that, let me just pick up on something that the Minister spoke about. I mean, we are a developing country, so there is a huge emphasis on the political side of the economy. But what people need to really keep at the back of their minds when they look at South Africa is that it's a country with a really robust and lively private sector. In as much as we look at government and we say we haven't created all these jobs, actually it's the private sector that creates jobs. Government can create non-sustainable jobs, short-term perhaps, but on a long-term sustainable basis, it is actually the private sector that's meant to do this. And insofar as we are failing in doing our job, then we are going to fail to tackle unemployment in South Africa. And the best thing that has come out in this particular area of government-business interface is what Bronwyn referred to, which is a national development plan. What this does, apart from, is there buy-in, is there a social compact, is it lowers the dissonance between those two very important elements that need to work together in order to address job growth. Without addressing job growth, you cannot address the issue of a trickle-down or a sharing of benefits and inclusivity in our economy. So if there is one particular area that the private sector has to worry itself about, is to create jobs in order then to lift even more people out of poverty. But on a very, very short-term basis, it is very true that we have all struggled, particularly the manufacturing sector, principally because there's such a close linkage between what we do at the very, very southern tip of Africa with what happens in other parts of the world. We are a globalized world. So the fact that we've been growing 2% is not, in my mind, funny or strange. The fact that we've managed to grow positively, I think, is a good story. But as the world starts to come out of recession, I see more and more of that beginning to affect us in South Africa. Now, coming back to what we do specifically in the manufacturing sector, apart from looking to Europe and our traditional partners in terms of trade, we've done a lot in starting to trade closer to home. So in our particular case, for example, trading with neighboring countries has been a particular focus. As South Africa has gone into the BRICS enclave, we've looked more and more at those opportunities in order to either stay at similar growth levels. Obviously, we haven't gone to pre-crisis growth, but in order to stabilize growth and start to grow again. So in the very short term, the real focus for South African business is to get back onto the saddle and start to grow again at pre-crisis levels, which we simply haven't done. But I do think that it's important to realize that it's not just a government initiative, this. We see it very much as a partnership between government and business.
On that note, Jabu, let's bring you in as the voice of Business Unity South Africa and how business is going to contribute to the issue that we're facing.
Yeah, Bronwyn, I think it's difficult not to talk as South Africans because we're in Switzerland. I think we always need to remember our history. Switzerland is cold. I think when summer comes, we always forget how cold winter was. We have just come to the 20th year of our democracy. The big part of the start of that 20 years, the Nelson Mandela government, spent a lot of time trying to deal with a divided South Africa that was at war with itself. A racially divided security force to try and reconcile our country. So it's important that we understand that we could not even be bothered about growth. We should be worried about we don't have a country. So we spent a lot of time as a nation under the ANC leadership of Mandela at the time to bring this country to be one. That has taken a lot of effort, a lot of time, and a lot of resources. Secondly, we've had growth in South Africa. But that growth was for some. That growth did not include everybody else. We need to remember that. So we've been here before. We have inherited a country that was at the brink of bankruptcy. That's the country that the ANC under Mandela inherited. We need not to forget that. Where we are now, we have a vision of where we should go by 2030. We all know where we should go. We have a vision. We need now to get total buy-in into this vision. Total buy-in by government, at provincial, local, and at every level, by business and labor. It's fine to have debates on the side about it, but there's no more a debate about whether this is the plan. This vision, Bronwyn, is not a vision that was cooked by some academics in some room. This is a vision that was baked by South Africans themselves. And I think we need to always have this in its proper context. This vision is one that we need to stop debating about, but we also now know when we must have achieved this. It's the how. I also think there are some prerequisites that we need to deal with. The beauty about the National Development Plan, it actually talks about itself, about how it should be implemented. We now need to see the NDP as our economic constitution.
Absolutely, Jabu, point taken. I want to just set out at this point in the discussion, I am an Afro-optimist. I believe firmly about the African growth opportunity. I, as a journalist, have to put forward that African story and try not to be negative about some of the news flow that is taking place on the continent at the moment. Minister, you will remember well that last year, when we had this very same platform, we were fielding questions about Marikana. 34 people were killed on the 14th of August in the wildcat strikes at Lonmin. And we took center stage. President Zuma sat on that panel discussion with me in front of global leaders on the World Economic Forum stage and had to field questions around Marikana. Now, South Africa is part of, in this platform or on this platform, the African continent. We know that well. We're dealing right now with the Central African Republic, South Sudan. Those states are seeing incredible violence and families, people are being devastated, they are leaving their homes. And again, we have this picture of the African continent that we have to put forward a good footing on. So we're going to have to deal with those questions. And I'm sure the minister delegation here at the World Economic Forum is going to be asked the tough questions. What are we doing in terms of our contribution to the Central African Republic, to peace and stability on the African continent, which is crucial to the viability and the sustainability of the enormous growth and optimism that we've seen. So, Minister, in that context, if I can bring you to what is happening in Central African Republic and also in South Sudan, the international community is considering that we may see failed states in both of those territories and follow the likes of a Somalia. What is your response? And now for the international community that we'll be facing.
I saw a magazine yesterday which was talking about the failure of the failed state concept. But it's, so I think history moves on and theories move on. Look, every part of the world has its challenges. If you look at Central Asia, as we move on to the Winter Olympics, you can see the challenges there. Many parts of South America have their challenges. So the African continent has its share. And in many instances, there is a view which says that former colonial masters haven't quite disengaged themselves sufficiently to allow Africans to sort out their own problems. And so from a South African point of view, we committed to stability in Africa. We've had many years of involvement in the role of supplying peacekeeping forces to supplement that which the UN and others are actually doing. And both diplomatically and otherwise, we all know that greater efforts need to be put in. The AU needs to be strengthened. And on and off, and I'm sure you're going to hear it on the platform today, Africans believe they have the capacity, if supported in the right way, to resolve some of these challenges. But there's a wider discourse that I think we need to watch out for at Davos this year. It's one that started once the talk of quantitative easing, tapering, was announced in May last year. And that is the negative narrative about emerging markets. It's a dangerous narrative. We live, on the one hand, we say, in an interdependent and interconnected world, but when it suits us geopolitically, then we are ready to say, some amongst the world community, that, well, it's the emerging markets that are the problem. They're actually not making a sufficient contribution to global growth. We just had the figures from Colin, which indicate that even now, emerging markets will be making a significant contribution. And the world is not suddenly, in a year or two, going to be disconnected with itself. Nor are we going to have a shift from multipolarity, which was the in-fashion word 2 years ago, suddenly back to a unipolar world either. So I think all of us who have an interest in emerging markets, whether we foreign investors or South African investors and government representatives, have an interest in ensuring that this negative narrative about emerging markets disappears once we leave Davos.
Minister, just to stay with you for a moment, yesterday, I think it was on Monday the 20th, you were quoted in the Business Days just saying that South Africa cannot afford any more unrest in the mining environment. Would you like to elaborate on that statement?
There have been notices issued to both a few gold mining companies and several of the platinum mining companies by a particular trade union that some labor action might be taken in the next few days. What I can say is that from a government point of view, government has reactivated the process that the Deputy President has been leading. The Ministers of Labour and of Mineral Resources are fully engaged, both on the labour side and on the mining company side, to ensure that we have the stability that we require, and that other rivalries shouldn't lead to more disruption in production at a time when South Africans need to export as much as possible in order to contribute in the right way to the current account deficit.
Colin, if you see the rand as the share price of South Africa, and we know that it is under pressure right now, the Minister makes reference to the quantitative easing scenario and the tapering of that situation, which is leading to money flowing out of emerging markets. How do you sell South Africa Incorporated to your peer group when you are with your international colleagues?
Look, South Africa is, in terms of liquidity, financial sophistication, management sophistication, and Nku mentioned, is a very powerful story at the tip of Africa, high growth story. And so we've got to be realistic. This developed market-led recovery with the United States, Europe, and so on in better health is going to mean the global capital flows will favor that developed market bias. So people will take a view on perceived lower risk, higher yielding stocks and bonds relative to the emerging markets. It doesn't mean emerging markets are doing any less well. In fact, we think in the second half of 2014, South Africa and Africa will feel the benefit of the developed market recovery. And so there will be a balance in the flows of the currency we expect. We think right now, it's heavily sold. The rand is heavily sold where it is.
Are you finding it difficult to convince your colleagues of the South African story?
No, I don't. I'm not saying that at all. I think that South Africa, has a very balanced, good story to tell. But the fact is that 3% growth, which is where Goldman Sachs, for example, sees it, we have to get the game up. So, what Jabu and the minister are saying is, let's implement the National Development Plan, let's invest in the country, let's get the African markets growing, overcome some of the wobbles on the continent. We're going to be in a very strong place. There's a lot of very positive issues behind South Africa.
Jabu, you want to add?
Yeah, I think just to stay with this theme of interconnectedness, and that's the message we tried to carry across at the last G20 summit in St. Petersburg, is to say the developed world, whatever they do, they must always remember that we are one. We have had benefits of flows that come as a result of actions they've taken. When they change their actions, the opposite is going to be true as well. Two, we need to also recognize that the world is the world that we play in. Maybe 60% of the things that happens to us are outside of our control. The 30 or 40% that we can control is what this NDP is about. We can do very little either than doing right in our own backyard. Then be in a position to go and sell our produce at the market acceptable prices.
If I can just add to what Colin and Jabu have said, I think we must also help to demystify some of this phenomena, because market talk is for a select few, and it can easily be misunderstood. So firstly, as Colin was saying, understand the global context. There's a significant shift as you get better growth prospects in the US. Remember, Europe is still pretty much static but stable. Secondly, the tapering of quantitative easing which is where the US was putting in $85 billion a month into the system, now $75 billion a month, is going to have an impact in terms of the amount of liquidity that's moving around. Thirdly, it's the financial markets and financial investors who are looking for new, quick, and high return opportunities for investment. We must distinguish between the financial markets and the real economies. It's the real economy that creates jobs. It's the real economy that creates skills, and of course demand skills as well. And often in our discourse, we don't focus sufficiently on what's happening in the real economies of the world. In the case of South Africa, I know there are people here who make investment decisions for 20, 30, 40-year periods, not 6 months and 6 weeks. And it's how they make those decisions and how we as a country, both as private sector and government, create the right kind of atmosphere and stability that will ensure that they make the decision to invest in a country like South Africa. And all of us can, in fact, start focusing on the real economy and real jobs, real industrialization, and real value add, not just in South Africa, but on the African continent as well.
Perhaps let's drill down into this industrial revolution that we are starting to see taking place on the African continent. And Monhla, let's bring you in as the IDC here. Minister refers to 20, 30-year, 40-year investment plans. You must be at the heart of that.
Yes, and I think, in all honesty, it's easy to talk about agility when you're speaking about businesses. But I think countries also have got to develop the agility, regardless of what happens with the market changes, that you are resilient. And I think the challenge for South Africa to emerge out of phase one of the first 20 years, where the basics of inclusivity, trying to bring people in, trying to deal with too much of industry being in mining, and now ending up with a stagnating manufacturing and mining sector, is that the need for agility, innovation, and creativity doesn't go away. We've got to figure out how our urban nodes become bigger players in economic activities, small industry, and we must deal with why manufacturing and mining cannot contribute even more towards the kind of growth that we are dealing with. I think from the IDC point of view, what we are seeing is a country on the verge of a robust, I think, dialogue that says, how do we as business, as state-owned enterprises that play meaningfully and need capitalization, how do we make sure that we create that agility in our small country and small economy compared to the big ones to keep growing steadily, surely, while distributing. That will never go away regardless of what happens with the
Nku,
big
you've got a
economies.
plan.
Well, not so much as a plan as to remind people why the African story at this particular time is so exciting. And I just give you two things to consider. One, it is the one continent where we still have a huge demographic dividend that is still to pay out. As you look at China, actually, following in the footsteps of Japan, getting older, we are just getting into this bump of young people that are going to come into their productive years. And we've got the biggest proportion of that of any other continent that you can care to think about. And South Africa is very much within also that particular cycle. Secondly, we're urbanizing. If you can see what's happened with China again in how they've been able to rebuild and to accelerate their manufacturing industrial base on the back of an urbanizing trend, that's basically where the African continent is. And so you look at the big cities of the future that are going to be created, a lot of the mega cities you're going to find on the African continent. So that hasn't gone away, and it's how we exploit those two in particular as we move forward. And we all understand, Minister spoke about it a little bit earlier, that education is going to be the bedrock on which this is built. So we understand that there is a lack of skills and that we have to pay attention to. It doesn't take away the fundamentals that we have actually quite an exciting story just in the near term. Now, we know that in order to rebuild an industrial base that is eroding, there needs to be some government intervention, there needs to be some private sector spend in the future that happens. And I think we're not yet getting that right. But just look at the telecom space, look at the ICT space in the African continent. It is the most exciting thing you've ever seen. You go to Kenya, you go to Tanzania, and you look at how people are using mobile technology to leapfrog what had always been very much an infrastructure block because we didn't have landlines. So there are any number of things that investors looking at the continent and looking at South Africa in particular as a conduit to all of those opportunities can come in and participate in, because the minister's right. It's not the short-term movements in your share price that matter. It's the long-term fundamental base upon which an investment is built.
Another opportunity is that Africa is home to 60% of the uncultivated arable land in the world. Agriculture has to start taking center stage. And according to Grow Africa, which is part of the World Economic Forum platform, Africa this year, agriculture is the year 2014 for agriculture to take center stage and investment on that front. Jabu, are you seeing moves to agriculture, to investment in that front?
The unfortunate narrative that we should always try and change is the narrative that says other countries in Africa are growing, South Africa is not. I think it's a narrative we should... we've never seen the growth of South Africa in exclusion of the other parts of the continent, we as South Africans. So for us, it's not the zero sum. It's not, it must be Nigeria or South Africa. For us, is the continent has to grow. We as South Africa are playing our part in seeing to it the continent grows. We are involved as South Africa at SADC with COMESA and the other region where there is about 600 million people. This we see as markets. As South African business, we see that we're having preemptive rights in those markets.
So there you highlight another opportunity.
Yep.
Intra-Africa trade. We've got almost 1 billion people on the continent. Why aren't we servicing those billion? We've got the population growing to 2 billion by 2050. The stat out there, Jabu, is that intra-African trade is only sitting at 11%. I had a conversation with Julian Roberts the other day who said that it took him 4 hours to cross the border post in between two African countries. That has to be something that we can unlock, to your point.
But Bronwyn, the other stat, though, that we should always say is that South Africa is the biggest foreign direct investor in Africa.
Great
Facts.
stat. Great stat to hang our hat on.
So this notion that the growth of Nigeria means the no growth of South Africa is a narrative that we as South Africans and as Africans should not continue to sell. We've got to say the growth of Africa is the growth of South Africa. The growth of South Africa is that of Africa.
And I think proof of that, is the fact that when Europe found itself in trouble after 2008, it's the SADC region that picked up the slack in terms of our exports and their imports of South African manufactured goods. So today, SADC is the major market for manufactured goods versus Europe.
I want to
So
yes, Nku.
Well, look, the whole issue is, I mean, we tell the truth. Sometimes it's good to tell the whole truth. And the whole truth is we're not inviting investors to a perfect environment. There are issues. We have to certainly tackle border post issues. We send trucks into the overland markets, and it does take a long time. The fact of the matter is, if we recognize this, we do have forums within which such issues of trade get debated. And so if anybody were waiting for perfection, probably you wouldn't come. But there is enough going on in that part of the world to make it exciting, despite the difficulties. And everybody that I meet who's been to South Africa come back saying, incredible what a can-do attitude the people of that particular region have. And so we find solutions. We get workarounds. They're not perfect, but we continue to do really, really good business despite all of those difficulties. So come and you will find ways to break through.
Monhla?
I think one of my biggest wishes is the ability of Africans to measure and to understand themselves and to know exactly where they are. Inter-African trade, you're correct, is very limited. But every day, the African barefoot walking across the border, every good that you find in South Africa, you'll find in some village. Because informal trade in Africa has probably connected the continent better than the formal sector. And the issue is, what can we learn from that? Instead of pretending that it doesn't happen, and we go with one number of what we can measure and we say, it's so constrained. And the more those of us who are in business, who are dealing with every country, the more we can measure, the more we can calculate, the more we can analyze the real situation, we'll find out that there's actually a lot to build on in terms of intra-Africa trade. In fact, the more formal you are, the more you tax people, the more they see liability at every border. What do people do? They go informally to try and avoid the formal sector. I believe that there is a lot happening between the people of Africa in spite of the formal sector.
But then why?
What we need to do.
Monhla, I mean, I am so excited about this intra-African trade opportunity because I was looking for reasons or avenues to boost growth across the African continent. That billion people that we've got on our doorstep utilize that opportunity. Why can't we take the lead from the informal sector? And the frustration here is that in 2006 at the World Economic Forum on Africa, I was debating exactly the same thing, intra-African trade. And it doesn't look as though that stat, and Monhla, unfortunately, that formal stat is the one that we've got to throw around. It doesn't look as though there is any alleviation or any improvement in it. So I want to get excited, and I want us to say, isn't that a short-term goal that we can strive for as Africa to make that opportunity work for us? And not debate it and continue to debate it over and over at these platforms.
I think in the next 10 years it's going to happen.
Can I take on the challenge?
As the production capabilities in African countries improves, as the skills level improve, as investment starts happening in the right place, for the better part of the last 5 years, African leaders have been talking about all sorts of north, south, east, west, corridors in order to expedite movement. Border posts are a challenge, but they're a challenge because customs officers don't get paid well, or immigration officers don't get paid well, and bribes, as it happens in other parts of the world, is what actually holds you up. So there are many countries that are automating their systems now that will also facilitate trade as we go. But one of the challenges I think one of my colleagues posed is something that we need to look at. How can countries and companies be a lot more nimble and agile and responsive to opportunities? And I'm not sure we're there yet.
I was just going to add that, I think under the surface there's a lot of that homework being done. So I agree with the Minister when he says you're going to see this in the future. If you just look at the transaction flows, if the bankers in the room will tell you, it's increasingly a mix of South Africa, cross-border Africa transactions. So the number of South Africans or Nigerians or global companies involved in transactional flow has increased significantly around places like Kenya, Nigeria, Mozambique, Angola. And so it's becoming a far more enmeshed situation. And I think that reflects that there is ongoing processes. You look at ShopRite, you look at Massmart, you look at a lot of the banks, the telecom companies. We are effectively day by day improving the institutional environment in which business is working.
Monhla.
I think you're talking about excitement. I think talking about the informal sector and how the mobile telephone technology has just made it possible for you to then have that excitement and smile. Because that woman trader today will know exactly where she can get her goods. Because on her cell phone, she can find a counterparty that she has to deal with. And more than that, with remittances, she's got some disposable income and she can trade. And more and more, we are improving. But for me, I'm more empowered when I know my situation and I know what I have to deal with. Africans, we've got great men and women that trade every day.
It's very, very easy to forget the things that we do well. And to be fair, we've had this best regulated securities exchange in South Africa for many years, and we basically start to take that for granted. It is the one part of emerging markets, if you look at emerging markets as a whole, where you know that if you invest that money, it will come out and somebody will make sure that it does so. If something goes wrong, you know that there is a judicial process that is fair to you, that will protect you. You know that the security of your tenant and property, because we've got institutions that we've built up to give all of those protections. And those things should not be taken for granted because you don't find them willy-nilly anywhere one goes. So in essence, if you then start to take all the plus and the minuses, there's a lot more pluses out there. We just have to find ways, as I said before, to exploit them a little bit better.
Minister Karim, could I get you to perhaps just say a few words about technology, innovation? We're seeing it as a solution to so many different challenges that we're facing. If you could just comment on your plans and where we're going.
Yeah, very briefly, on the 4th of December last year, Cabinet adopted the broadband policy strategy and plan. We've already begun to implement it. Next week, we appoint a broadband council, which will have representatives, civil society, individual experts included, industry and government. We've already begun actually to exceed our targets in schools connectivity. We targeted 1,500 schools between the 4th of December and the April-May elections. We've already, thanks to Telkom, the mobile operators in South Africa and other actors, not least government, we've now achieved a target of 1,300 schools already. Linked to that also is an attempt to have a fundamentally new ICT dispensation. We've now gazetted, in fact, well, today I think, a green paper for a more national integrated ICT policy because of convergence in technologies. We've had separate white papers in the first 5 years of our democratic dispensation on the postal services, telecommunications and broadcasting. We're now looking to that being integrated, and in fact, on the 24th of February, we have a national public consultation process beginning on that green paper, and flowing from that 9 provincial hearings. We also have made some progress, though not enough, on settling the dispute amongst the broadcasters in South Africa and to a less extent manufacturers on the digital migration policy, which is closely linked to broadband. We're very, very clear with 1.3% growth rates flowing from a 10% broadband penetration, with the recognition that 6% of the GDP today comes from ICT, with the recognition that we cannot move forward. Investors, of course, complain that one, at least, of the reasons they don't want to invest is because of our ICT sector and because of broadband. Well, here it is. We're poised on a substantial progress in that regard, but again and again and again we say, as government alone, we can't do it. We need the private sector. We have a very effective policy there in the broadband policy that talks of public-private participation. We're talking of an open access wholesale broadband network. So working together, we can get there, and we certainly will.
And you can make a dent to the education situation. You mentioned the schools that you engage in.
Yes.
When I arrived in Zurich, I saw a poster saying online MBA, 18 months, and I thought that's exactly where we need to go.
Yes, that's where we need to go. Can I say one final thing? Because Nelson Mandela looms, as he inevitably must, on this sitting and elsewhere. We cannot separate Nelson Mandela from what this country is capable of. He didn't fall from the skies. Nor did Archbishop Tutu, who's globally loved and liked and respected, and rightly so. They didn't fall from the skies. They're an organic outgrowth of what South Africa is entirely capable of. We've had regular elections, free and fair, often freer and fairer than some of the countries in Europe. Let's not talk about Al Gore and George Bush at the time and how that happened, okay? Let's talk about 2010. FIFA says, well, let's see what Brazil does. In fact, the complaints about Brazil, with great respect to our partners, is far greater than ours. We've delivered our stadium, or stadia, or whatever the word is, long before the schedules. There's all those issues. In short, 2010 didn't fall from the skies either. It's a reflection of what this wonderful country is capable of. So don't separate Nelson Mandela from his country. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I at this point just open to anybody who would like to address a question to our panel?
I'm Petrus de Kok. I'm research manager with Brand South Africa. The question goes to Minister Gordhan. You made a comment on the... you made a comment earlier on we must watch out for the negative discourse on the emerging markets. Now, I have a question related to that is on the BRICS. As host nation of the BRICS summit, we're coming to the end of that year. And as Minister of Finance, also the ministry has taken a lead in a lot of the activities around the BRICS. What do you see as the best outcome for us as a country? There's several platforms that's been created, the Business Council and several other structures. How do you see us as a country moving deeper into the BRICS space and kind of owning the discourse of the emerging markets more and opening opportunities? Because I honestly think there's a lot of fallacies around the structural challenges that we still have in the world economy, and how can we incrementally work on opening more and new opportunities? So that's my question.
We live in a world of what they call co-opetition. You cooperate where it's possible and where you have common interests, and otherwise you compete. And we've been saying to South Africans, build up your capability to compete. Just being a member of BRICS doesn't give you honorary status and access to markets or opportunities in the BRICS countries. Secondly, you'll notice that on the program is also BRICS ... midlife crisis. No sooner has BRICS come onto the scene, as part of the negative EM narrative, you now have these questions, where is BRICS going? But we are making real progress during the course of this year on the new development bank, and so we hope that as we hand over to Brazil as the next chair of BRICS, we can show that the bank is about to find its feet and get off the ground. And similar progress has been made in 2 or 3 other areas as well, such as the contingency reserve arrangement. But geopolitically, as the narrative changes in the developed part of the world, the developing world will have all sorts of fingers pointing towards it. But the reality is we have increased intra-BRICS trade, we've increased intra-BRICS investment. My colleague next door is talking about how South African skills are being deployed in India and Brazil to improve their airports. At least those airports are moving faster than the stadia in certain instances in terms of construction. But ahead of us lies a whole series of opportunities. And the question is how strong, how able and capable are we to seize those opportunities. And that lies in our hands and in nobody else's hands.
And the Kenyan voice in the room, Juliana from Ushahidi, non-for-profit organization out of Kenya.
I appreciated the comments about the informal sector and the importance of using technology to open up that very, very important sector. The question for the panel is actually around this question of intra-African trade. Very inspired to be here to engage with a very important part of Africa, and the tagline, inspiring new ways, is something that I wonder, what is the plan around Brand South Africa inspiring other African countries? Because we can't really have we can't have more intra-African trade if we do not change the perceptions of African countries towards each other. Because I think that's the problem. We don't have enough information about what are the foreign direct investment that South Africa is putting into other African countries, and what other African countries could possibly provide for South Africa. So that's my question. What is Brand South Africa's plan for intra-continental inspiration, if you want to call it? Thank you.
Monhla, you brought up the issue of intra-trade. Would you like to take the stage here?
I think the question is more challenging to me, actually, because you're talking to the issue of attitudes. That probably part of the reason why we still cannot remove the immigration and customs rules, that maybe less about customs. And I'm glad the mayor of our great city of Johannesburg is here. One of my biggest dreams was to always see the day when any top business person in Africa can have an apartment in Johannesburg, one in the middle of Nairobi, because that's where he does business, and whenever he goes around, he doesn't need to have a visa. But because of probably historical attitudes, because we must accept who we are and where we come from and deal with those issues in order to move ahead. To pretend that there aren't challenges. Everyone wants an airline with their country's name on it, no matter the economics don't make sense. But simply because one believes seeing it there means that I am in the upper frontier of the curve. I think the African age of recognizing that we don't have to feel so small with each other, but bigger with one another, is beginning to happen. Because by sitting together, we demystify that myth. But I think the greater opportunity and challenge is on our great cities. I think let them challenge their political and national governments to say, I want every top business person in this continent to be having something in my city. And please don't stop me. And maybe these things would change. Mayor of Johannesburg, our biggest city, I think for me, you would do that for me, I will be the happiest.
I know Jabu wants to add, and I do have another question. Jabu, if you'd like to.
Yeah, I think just as an example of what we can do in dealing with the attitudes and image and perception, you know, in the travel and tourism environment, I was listening to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in South Sudan in DC at the beginning of December, talking about in South Sudan, they've got the real elephants. If you want to see real elephants, you must go there. I think if we start looking at, as I say, from a tourism point, an itinerary that says you can see real elephants in the South Sudan, you can go and see the migration in Serengeti, and you can go and see one of the world's 7 wonders in Cape Town. And then start to deal with how does SAA, Ethiopian Air, and Kenya Airways make sure that this itinerary results, Mila Matola brand SA, comes from that environment. So these kind of conversations would definitely emerge to these inspiring new ways as we reshape the world, our own world first.
I'm afraid I have run out of time for questions, and I'm going to move quickly to a quick statement from each of my panelists on Brand Africa, the #1 selling proposition as we go out of this room and we network with the World Economic Forum colleagues. Minister, if I could start with you, and I'll go through the panel in conclusion. Minister.
Well, Africa is the world's future as it was the world's past. So here's 1 billion more consumers. Here's where the new growth prospects are going to come from. Here's the demographic dividend, as Nku was pointing out earlier on. And in the next 10 to 15 years, the future lies here.
Monhla?
The future of Africa lies with less bureaucratic rules on the public, which means less government bureaucracy. The more we can find opportunities to remove it, the more the Africans can continue to excel.
Nku?
If there is going to be a continent that gives the world soul, this is it. If there is one thing that unites Africans, it is the fact that we go beyond purely counting the numbers in the GDP. We know that's not enough anymore. We go to India, to Bhutan, to see why people there are happy. You don't have to go very, very far to find out why people have got soul rather than this continent.
Colin?
For investors in South Africa, or people looking to invest in South Africa, the 2 Decades of Freedom report of Goldman Sachs hopefully tries to encapsulate a balanced perspective based on fact. Look back 20 years, see the achievements. There have been remarkable achievements. We can own the challenges. South Africa is doing that, and we're going to address them. But I think there's hope that we are effectively moving forward, and there's a lot of hope from the African continent in terms of coming from a low base, but growing at exceptional rates.
Jabu, final word on Brand Africa.
Yeah, for my sins, I'm co-chair for the next World Economic Forum on Africa. Happy to you and the lady from Kenya. I'll talk to Elsie. You've got a session on Brand Africa. Prepare.